when you are now at war, because like I always say, because I'm a Christian, most of the time I'm referring to anyone who has a similar mind. So when you then understand how circumstances can either be aligned either for you or against you, then you automatically join what they call spiritual warfare. Spiritual warfare is for Christians, the equivalent of, for those who understand um, ancestral culture or cultural backgrounds, or going to sangomas, going to mediums, that type of lifestyle. Spiritual warfare is what Christians get into when you enter into that process. It's a process of understanding how, because the world is 100% physical and 100% spiritual at the same time, that means that there are ways in which people are living their lives completely spiritual and not physical. You could find yourself either living life physically or spiritually, but at some point you will need both. You'll need both, or you'll need to understand both to an extent. Any person who's of age, any person who's matured in life, you will come across what they start to call spirituality, real spirituality. And when you understand these concepts, then you know that in terms of your circumstances aligning in your favor, there could be, attacks that come from either individuals, people, or people who have ill intent, who use spiritual methods with ill intent. Some people, claim to have good intent while using spiritual methods. But for me, most of the time, I find it very difficult for, someone who has the ability to, access certain information and get into certain places to remain uncompromised. They always say that power corrupts. I say not necessarily true, but at the same time it's true, because having power sometimes gives people the right to do things that they probably shouldn't be doing. But because they have that power, who can stop them? So what you need to then understand is that in these spiritual methods that people have belief structures like, if you want a person, you can manifest them. If you want to be with a person who doesn't want to be with you, there's a magic potion that you can create that can make them like you back. And there's people who have ill intent over your life. Maybe it's your relatives, maybe it's close family members, or whatever it is, who might try to use these ill intentful spiritual methods. So when you're a Christian and you start trying to understand spirituality, then you have to understand that circumstances not aligning in your favor for an extended duration of time, majority of the time, is an indicator of you being under spiritual attack. Being under spiritual attack puts you in spiritual warfare. That's why they call it spiritual warfare, because in that period, I always like to refer to Job. If you guys read the Bible, I always like to refer to Job because it's a perfect example of how when he went into a specific season, and Satan came to God and said, this guy only behaves this way because you haven't tested him. If you tested him, I promise you he wouldn't be the guy that you see him to be. So God allows for Job's hedge to be lowered so that Satan could have rule or an opportunity to test Job. And what you realize in that testing is that the type of things that Satan had control over in that testing should open your eyes. Satan had control over Job's life. Satan is against Job. Satan is making circumstances happen against Job. Luck, so Job, apparently, for a person who believes in luck, if you looked at Job's life from the moment that Satan had control over his life in that season, you'd see that he had a lot of bad luck. He lost his family, lost his job, lost money, lost, all these things, was sick. So if you are trying to understand spiritual warfare, then you have to understand that you can get into periods of your life where you will be at war with forces that have the ability to change things in your life. If you had a car, a force can steal your car. If you had a family, a force can steal your partner. If you have a relationship, a force can make your relationship difficult. When you start understanding that bad luck circumstances are part of the influence of these forces that I'm speaking of, because obviously, like I said, everyone has a God, everyone believes in something, then you're starting to awaken to spirituality. You're starting to understand more of how the spiritual world is linked to the physical world. So when you then understand that when Satan was, given authority over Job's life, Job went sick. That means there's a possibility that someone can use spiritual means to make you sick. That means someone can do a spiritual ritual, a spiritual potion thing, or whatever magic style that they're going to use that has the ability to make you sick. And God has the ability to, protect you or to take those sicknesses and, bad circumstances away. That's why we call it spiritual warfare, because the process of people trying to attack you and you resisting through prayer is spiritual warfare. So it's always important to understand this, especially when you come out into the real world, into the big bad world, because you never know who you have at your workplace. You never know who you have in your home. You never know who you have in your friendship groups. And because you never know who or where these people are, you want to be in the best mental prepared frame that you can be. You want to be aware of these things so that when you get into these spaces and see these people, you're never in a place of shock. You're never surprised by, spiritual warfare, or when certain things start happening to you.